So welcome, Yvette.
Thank you, Lynn. I appreciate the offer to speak for this conference, and I'm really excited about sharing this information with everyone tonight. So I'm going to share my screen at this point. So the PowerPoint is up. So just bear with me. Hold on, I'm trying to get to the, okay. All right. So thank you all so much for choosing. I know that there's a lot of activities or events you could be doing on a Wednesday night, of course, all of which are home because we're definitely still being mindful of COVID at this point. So to get started, because I want to make sure I can get through as much of my content as possible this evening, we'll move on to the first slide. So to begin this conversation, I thought it was important to make this statement so that everyone kind of has a sense of the direction that this presentation will go in. To understand our current human trafficking crisis, we must look at the history of exploitation that has brought us to this point. If we do not look back, sometimes it's very difficult for us to understand why are we struggling with and dealing with the issues that we're seeing in our current day society. So what I'm going to take you on is a journey of going back, looking at where exploitation, sexual and labor began, and then really bringing us back to current day and looking at some of the data and statistics related to human trafficking and race. So before I go in on that journey with you, I wanted us to start by taking a look at the definition of human trafficking. And this is the federal definition, which was enacted in 2000, so it's only 20 years old. And when I read this or you look at this definition, have it sit in your mind, because as we go through this presentation, you'll see how the language that is used in this it really came from a history of exploitation and abuse in this nation. So the federal definition, which is from the TVPA, defines human trafficking as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for two reasons: sex trafficking or labor trafficking. And with sex trafficking, it's a commercial sex act in which a commercial sex act is induced by force, fraud, or coercion. In simpler terms, a commercial sex act where there is an exchange of sex for anything of value. When we talk about sex trafficking on the national federal level, you do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion when you are speaking of minor victims. So for anyone under the age of 18, if there's an exchange of sex for anything of value, it is automatically in the federal definition considered sex trafficking. For adult victims, you will have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. And keep those words in mind: force, fraud, and coercion as we go through this dialogue. On the labor trafficking side, for both children and adults, you do have to prove force, fraud, or coercion. A lot of the work that I've done through HEART, we see a lot of victimization of minors that are sex trafficking victimization, a few cases of labor, but not as many on the child side. In my work with other organizations that work with adult survivors, you do see a lot of labor trafficking that occurs with adults in the state of Connecticut. I will share with you some national statistics, but I will also make sure I bring some local statistics to play as well in our conversation today. And with labor trafficking, we're talking about, involuntary servitude, peonage, debt bondage, any form of slavery where labor is a part of that equation. So a history of exploitation. So let's begin our journey with how do we get to this place of dealing with issues related to the victimization, the selling, the exploitation of people. So a history of exploitation, we're going to start with Native Americans, because at the end of the day, that is where the victimization began. You had indigenous people who were living here in the United States. This was their land. And we had individuals from Europe who came in and quote unquote discovered this land. And rather than being able to coexist and live peacefully with those who were here, it turned into murdering, raping, killing, etc., the native folks that were here and utilizing them in order to build the infrastructure of the US. So one of the things that's important for us to understand is that the tactics of subjugation that was used by the landed pioneers, colonial and American governments against Native men, women, girls, and boys have high resemblance to the tactics used by contemporary traffickers against their victims. And in the definition, I said to you, the current tactics are use of force, fraud, and coercion. And in my next slide, I will highlight for you some of the tactics that were used against the Native American people in order to get them to perform, in order to violate them sexually.
En el próximo slide.
And when we're talking about force, fraud, or coercion, let me just define those quickly. So with force, you're talking about the use of violence in order to get someone to do what you need them to do. When you're talking about fraud, we're talking about manipulation and deception. So, really trying to get that person to do what you want by manipulating their thinking or creating deception by promising things you know you will not follow through on. And then with coercion, we're looking at the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats to do it. So those are the three tactics currently being used, and you will see these tactics also being used when we talk about the victimization historically. Violence, threats of physical harm to individuals, violence where families were threatened or members of families were threatened, deprivation. One of the ways in which to keep someone oppressed is to deprive them of their basic needs. So deprivation of essential foods, water, clothing, and shelter. You had settlers who kidnapped Native individuals in order to get them to help with Western expansion, often forcing them to be interpreters and informants, which became a form of labor trafficking. You have the rape of Native women, and all non-white women was not considered rape. So there was no protection for Native women, boys, girls, or men under the law. So they were raped by a lot of the colonizers. And then settlement involved the enslaving of Native populations, both female and male, often using violent force to get them to do the labor that was required. So we're gonna move now to talk about the exploitation of Black individuals in America. And so I wanted to start, most of the time when we have this dialogue, we start with slavery and American slavery, because that is well known for many of us, but I wanted to go a step back. And when I saw this image, I had to incorporate it because it ties really well into giving you a visual of the mindset of those who were victimizing individuals centuries and centuries ago. So this is an image of 3 young white men and a Black woman from 1632. And if you look at this image, which is extremely disturbing, you can tell that there is an indication that there is some sexual activity that has been happening in this room. And you can see also the depiction of the Black woman as a beast or a monster, as, subhuman. And that, she doesn't have any value or worth, and she can't resist, and her resistance is considered comical and funny to these men that is in this image. And so you had from as early as 1632, and I'm sure before, this victimization that, Black women were the property of and could be exploited because they weren't human. And this image really depicts that messaging. So you flash forward now. So that messaging was there. That's already been set. That is how, Black women were being viewed by these white men. And then you move forward to American slavery, 1670s. So we're talking about almost 200 years later. And you have this image of a Black woman and a child that is on the auction block. And they are being viewed and reviewed by the slave owners to see whether or not they are property that these men want to purchase. And so this was a regular selling of human beings, was a regular practice during this time. And individuals who were being auctioned off were auctioned as if they were property, pretty much similar to like any crop you would sell or animal you would sell. That is the value that these humans were given by the slave owners. So that's a very startling image of what that process looked like and this idea of how people were sold back then. So then let's take a look at the sexual exploitation during American slavery time of Black individuals here in the United States. So owners of slaves could legally use them as sexual objects. There was no question or doubt that if you are my property, I can do whatever I want with you. So that was a standard practice. Slavery in the United States encompassed wide range in rape, sexual abuse, and also included unwanted pregnancies. No ability to sort of go to the law and say, listen, this is what's happening to me. Could you please help me? You know, this is the treatment I'm receiving. None of that was happening at that time. White men could legally rape their female slaves.
Are you okay?
Men and boys were also sexually abused by slave holders as well. So the victimization wasn't limited to just women and girls. It was also victimization that occurred to men and boys as well. It was completely legal to exploit children, to work them brutally, to whip them, and also to sexually abuse them. So yet again, there was no one that could escape the victimization of being sexually exploited. And then the last piece, which I thought was very telling around the mindset of having, you know, someone that you can victimize. Concubine slaves were the only female slaves who commanded a higher price than skilled male slaves. So a concubine who you could sexually exploit had more value than the slaves that were male slaves that were working in the fields. So sexual victimization, exploitation is pretty much built into the fabric of our society. So the federal human trafficking definition mirrors the actions and behaviors of slavery, indicating that the action of the founders of this nation continues to this day. The United States of America was built on the foundation of human trafficking, and centuries later, we continue to see that predominantly people of color are still the primary victims. And I'll start to go into some data where this is concerned. Black people were viewed as objects and property, and therefore could be bought and sold and exploited. American slavery was human trafficking, and people were exploited for both sex and labor trafficking. So it's important for us to understand that foundation. So this quote really does a good job of transitioning us now into our modern day conversation around this crime. So the racialized sexual exploitation of people of color that developed during slavery and colonization impacts cultural expectations and beliefs about the availability and use of children of color for commercial sex today. And that resonated with me, the availability and use. So this historical context of exploitation, this idea that people of color were property and anything could be done to them, has now been baked into the consciousness, and for generations and centuries being told or taught that victimization of these individuals was acceptable. And then our children in our current day society is being viewed as property and individuals that can continue to be exploited. And we'll see that in the data, that mindset continues on to this day. So let's quickly talk a little bit about some race-based myths about human trafficking, because there are a few. So the first one is the majority of victims are young white girls and women. And I'm going to give you a fact for every myth. So the reality is that this is the Bureau of Justice Statistic report. 77% of victims in alleged human trafficking incidents reported in the US were people of color. 77% of individuals who've been alleged for human trafficking were people of color. So the myth is that it's white girls and women, and that is not an accurate majority, and that's not an accurate statement. It is factual that white women and girls and boys and men are also trafficking victims and are also exploited, but they're not the majority of the victims. Majority of traffickers are Black men. So this idea of criminalizing and demonizing Black men, which has existed in our society for centuries, is now saying if your victims are white women and your abusers are Black men, creating now this tension between the white and Black community and making Black men to be criminals in this case. The reality, though, is anyone can be a trafficker. And from what we have seen for those, the few that are arrested and prosecuted, is that traffickers span a wide range of ethnic and racial groups. And so it is not predominantly all Black men. And we also do see women who are traffickers as well. So there's a lot of diversity. Anyone who benefits from the exploitation of another human being is a trafficker. And not only Black individuals are trafficking humans. White children are kidnapped and sold into foreign country. For our statistics and our data, the majority of trafficking victims that we have here in the United States were born here in the United States. They're not being exported out to foreign countries to be sold. A lot of these foreign countries have their own issues with human trafficking, their own children being exploited, and sadly to share, a lot of the victimization that are happening in those foreign countries is because we have individuals from the United States going into those countries and purchasing those children or adults for sex. So the United States definitely drives the demand for sex, not only in this country, but in other countries as well. And a lot of this myth comes from from the movie Taken, where you had this white young woman that was kidnapped and brought to a foreign country to be exploited, and her dad had to go and rescue her. And a lot of people continue that narrative in their mind. The last one is human trafficking victims are foreign-born individuals and those who are poor. As I said, anyone can be a victim of human trafficking. It does not discriminate, so it does cover a cross-section. The reason for this presentation is that disproportionately, people of color are victimized by human trafficking, and that's where the race piece comes into the equation, but it does not discriminate, and anyone can be. The reality is that the victims are majority victims born here, not born here in the United States. There are victims who are foreign born that come and are victimized here, but they are not the majority of the victims we see in the United States. And secondly, yes, poorness and poverty is a vulnerability, and I'll talk a little bit about that near the end. For people of color, but there are also individuals who live in very affluent communities that have means and resources that are also being victimized and are also trafficking others as well. So this graphic is very powerful. It depicts the breakout of human trafficking victims in the United States. And as you can see, you start with white population, Black population, Asian, Hispanic, and then other. And when you look at the distribution, yet again, the disproportionality that exists for people of color is very evident in this image. When you look at the Black, Asian, and Hispanic communities combined, they account for the majority. As I said before, the statistics states 77% of the victims of trafficking. One of the things I noted when I was doing this presentation, because I spoke in the beginning about the victimization of indigenous and Native people, was that they're not even represented on this map. It's a group of individuals that have been excluded, and they do account for a good percentage of current day victims of human trafficking. So I just wanted to note that out of respect for that community, that they are victims. We need to start to see them and talk about them. And the fact that they're not represented on a graph like this really speaks to the fact that the statistics and the data and the information around this population is not as widely accessible as it should be. So let's take a look at some data. And so this is data from a couple of states and as well as some national data, just to kind of frame how prevalent of an issue this is for communities of color. So in Louisiana, Black girls account for nearly 49% of the child sex trafficking victims in that state. And they only account for 19% of Louisiana's youth population. One of the things that we see, and we see it in the state of Connecticut as well, the representation of children of color is very low, but their representation as victims is extremely high in comparison to their representation in the population as a whole, yet again, speaking into this disproportionality and victimization of children of color. So King County, Washington, this one is even more startling. 84% of the child trafficking victims are Black, while Black children and adults together, not just Black children alone, but Black children and adults together in this county only accounts for 7% of the population. So this is a predominantly white community. And I actually met the representative from the state that does the trafficking work at a conference we went to. And she further went on in her conversation when she was sharing this data. to say that for a lot of the white men who were buying these Black girls, because she was able to say it was white men who were purchasing them, that a lot of them, didn't want to purchase children that looked like their daughters. And so to purchase a white girl would mean that a young white girl or a young white lady would probably make them think too much of their own children and their own family members. And so victimizing a child of color made more sense to them in this particular community. So the huge disproportionality, 7% of the population or less for the children, but 84% of the victims that in that state. So similarly, we have strong evidence in the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline, so that's through Polaris, that Latinos are disproportionately represented among human trafficking victims. In general, they account for a large percentage, as you saw in that graphic, but they specifically have a higher percentage when you're talking about labor trafficking. So their representation is even higher on the labor trafficking side. The Bureau of Justice as well reports that about 17% of human trafficking victims in the US are Asian. So another population that is definitely impacted by trafficking and fall within this disproportionality. And then the last statistics is that the National Congress of American Indians found that an estimated 40% of women who are victims of sex trafficking identify as American Indian, Alaskan Native, or First Nation. So when you look at these statistics, and the problem even with these statistics is that they don't even truly capture what is happening in the United States. And so what we have is sometimes older data that were captured at a certain point in time. And so we do need to demand and ask for more data related to trafficking and related to the racial identity of individuals who are being trafficked in the United States. So here's some data I wanted to share specific to Connecticut. So those were some national numbers, and I wanted to turn it to Connecticut. So while I was a HEART coordinator, I managed a lot of the data for the state related to cases that were referred to the Department of Children and Family. And back to about probably 2014 when I started, it's not captured on this graph, but we started to look at the data and realized that there was, a high percentage of individuals who were children of color. At the same time, we were also noticing that a high percentage of our cases were children living at home with their parent and guardian. So when I extracted the data to really pull out and break out the racial identity of these individuals, here's what the data looked like. So back in 2015, 67% of the cases that DCF received were children of color. And in general, I think between 2015 to 2018, DCF was hovering at around 200 on average cases per year, and unique cases, so not cases that repeated, but new cases every year. In 2016, that dropped to 60%, but still over 60%, more than 50% of the population, children of color. In 2017, 67%. And in 2018, we had a whopping high of 74% of children referred to the department for either high risk or confirmed victimization of human trafficking were children of color. I don't have DCF data for 2019 and 2020 because they're still, working on that data and cleaning it up. But what I do have to definitely demonstrate that this is a trend that continues, my good colleague and friend, Erin Williamson from Love 146, was able to share with me her data for Love 146 for 2019 and 20. And for those 2 years, Love 146 served 252 youth. And of that 252, 172 were children of color, which accounted for 68% of the clients that they serve. So yet again, another continuation of that trend that children of color are disproportionately represented in our data. So the question we have to ask ourselves at this point is why? Why people of color? Why are they so susceptible? Why are they being victimized? And I've already covered one of the biggest reasons. Historical trauma and cultural loss is a huge part of that equation, and a huge reason why people of color are identified and more vulnerable to victimization for trafficking, because we have a history, a legacy of victimization of people of color in this nation. Some other factors that have surfaced as folks have looked at vulnerability across communities is that the likelihood is, and for most people of color, is that there's a history of sexual and or physical abuse that may have occurred within the community or within family settings, community or family instability and dislocation, child welfare involvement, especially out of home foster care placement, life as a runaway or homeless youth, a disconnection from the education system and being off track for achievement. And I wanted to very much put in the school to prison pipeline. We know that there is a disproportionality that exists in the discipline of children of color, and especially a high percentage for even girls of color within our educational system. So when they're being pushed out of the school system, the reality is that we're pushing them not only in a direction towards maybe being imprisoned, but we're also pushing them towards traffickers who are just waiting to exploit them. Poverty, as I mentioned earlier, is a factor when you're looking at exploitation. If someone needs to meet their basic needs and someone approaches them with an opportunity to do so and convince them that they're going to help them and that they can, get them, what they need, the likelihood is that person is extremely vulnerable for a trafficker to take advantage of them. When we look at all of these issues, when we look at the victimization, the child welfare, the school issues, all of that, they all stand on the foundation of systemic racism that exists in this nation. The fact that these communities have always been marginalized and disenfranchised is part of the reason why they are vulnerable to this day. And so we have set a path and a pattern of victimization that continues in our current day society, that unless we really address these core causes, and especially the issue of racism, we are going to struggle to really address this issue of human trafficking. So before I end, because I do want to make sure that we have, appropriate time for question, I feel like it's always important to highlight and bring survivor voices to the table. It is important to hear their perspective, and it is important to hear what their experiences have been. And so I have two different survivor quotes that I'm going to share with you guys tonight that really, I felt, highlighted a lot of the messaging and information and history and pain and trauma of those colonizers and those slave owners to this current day, and that you see that in the language and the experience of these two individuals. So the first individual was a female survivor who is indigenous or Native American. And this is her words, and I'll make sure I read them clearly. He told me I owed him for everything he had done for me. He forced me to dress up like an Indian maiden to fulfill his European colonizer fantasy for his white friends. Each night I had to dress up and let them control my body. Watch with tears of anger sliding down my face as they disrespected me and my culture, which centered on honoring women and their life-given powers. These white men would whisper racist innuendos as they raped me. They would disrespect my sovereignty as a Native woman. The sad part of this is that we don't often hear these voices enough. We don't hear these stories enough of individuals of color who are being victimized. Their voices are not always at the forefront. And it is important for us to understand how they too are being brutalized and tormented and tortured by human trafficking. So I thought that her statement was not just she was being, sexually exploited, but her sexual exploitation was a manifestation of this individual's desire to have her play this role in order for him and his friends to feel like they are the European colonizers that used to do the same thing to her ancestors. The last survivor reflection is from a male survivor. At the time, a male survivor who is also a person of color. At the time of my victimization, I didn't know what human trafficking was, but I knew that being a person of color didn't make it any easier. Many of my buyers, both male and female, were white. The buyer was in charge and the victim was inferior. These power dynamics combined with racial differences heightened the perceived feeling of inferiority. There's a couple of other slides I have on this, but in the interest of time, I had cut them out of the presentation. But another piece that this survivor articulated in the retelling of his experience was that if you were a person of color, you were bought for less than. So in comparison to his white counterparts that were being victimized as well, they would have a higher value and people would pay more for them because of their whiteness than they would pay for him or any of the other children of color that were being sold. Yet again, perpetuating this concept of you have no value, your worth is not as great as that of these other individuals. So even in the midst of exploitation across this racial group of individuals, a person of color is still left with this idea that your value is not as great as your white counterpart. And so we're going to sell you for less. The other thing that he talked a lot about in his story was also this idea of people wanting to fulfill fetishes. So you put in, I want to have sex with a black male because, I want to be with a thug or something else like that. So creating this narrative that they've held in their mind from this idea and notion of who people of color are, and then wanting to live out this fantasy, very much like what was just described by that Native woman in her reflection of her victimization. When I read these survivors' reflections, they echo the history of racial oppression that exists in our nation. You cannot avoid it. You cannot not see the connection. You cannot own that as a society. We have done a serious injustice for people of color because there's a part of our society that has turned a blind eye, that has allowed for the perpetuation of this level of victimization for individuals of color, and that even to this day, we still are not demonstrating our rage and upset for the fact that so many people of color are being victimized. Because when you look at the arrest and prosecution data for buyers who are predominantly white male and traffickers who I said cross the spectrum, you're not seeing the arrest rates and prosecution rates that you should for the level of victimization that is happening in our nation. So it really speaks to the fact of what message are we sending to these victims about their value and their worth, and how upset and angry we are that anyone in 2021 is still experiencing this level of victimization that mirrors so concretely the exploitation during slavery and the exploitation during the colonizing of America with the Native American people. So it is so clear that the power imbalance that exists based on race has allowed for and perpetuated the exploitation of people of color, which is why this conversation and this dialogue is so critically important. And I'm hoping that, during the question and answer period, we'll have an opportunity for folks to share their response and thoughts and ideas on this topic. But it really speaks to what is our call to action? What do we take away from this? Why is this conversation so critically important? And why do we need to start to change the lens and our view about how we think about and how we manage and deal with this issue of sexual and labor exploitation in our nation? So I thought this quote, yet again, another quote that resonated well with me, and I think really speaks to what the call to action needs to be, should be, and have to be when we're having these conversations continually about human trafficking. This is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. There's a lot of dialogues, a lot of trainings, webinars, conversations that are happening across our nation on this topic. There's a lot of social media posts around human trafficking awareness and letting people know that this is happening. But what you don't often see is dialogues that really focus on race, and dialogues that really focus on who are these victims of trafficking and what do we truly need to do to make sure that this crime is eradicated from our society. So this quote states clearly, racism is deeply embedded in human trafficking and must be racially inclusive and explicitly included in its literature, statistics, and advocacy. To combat this modern-day slavery, the trafficking cycle should recognize explicitly the connections between trafficking, migration, poverty, racism, gender, and racial discrimination. If we are not having these conversations at the tables that we sit, if we are not elevating this topic in everyday conversation around human trafficking, if we are not using the lens of racism and a history of exploitation, How do we then move the work forward? How do we end this from happening? How do we make folks understand the severity of this crime in our nation and why we need to do something about it? So I call to all of you who are watching today to really challenge yourself to say, what is it that I can do? How can I make a difference moving forward to ensure that these vulnerable individuals are definitely cared for? So with that, I'm going to end in order for us to have time for questions and answers, and also time for us to wrap up our presentation. Lynn, let me know if you want me to take it off of slideshow mode.
Yeah, why don't you do that? Okay. Well, first of all, thank you. I think everyone needs to exhale and breathe a little bit, because there's a lot of information, a lot of disturbing statistics for sure, especially for people who have not been involved in human trafficking awareness, and this is the first time they're hearing all of this. So there are a few questions that came in. Maybe the first one is if you can talk a little bit about what is being done for law enforcement in Connecticut. Like, we've heard all these despicable things. What is law enforcement like in Connecticut?
So the work that I've done for the last 5 years, part of one of the major accomplishment we had during the HEART grant and continue to have is that we have now a ton of law enforcement officers who have been trained in human trafficking. There's several curriculums that DCF HEART does for both law enforcement, medical providers, basic community providers, parents, etc. And we have a ton of law enforcement officers that are trainers now. We've really done a good job of trying to change the mindset. A lot of officers that this is not a choice that these young women, these children or adults are making, that it is a form of victimization. And so that change has helped now for officers to think more, and to actually, when they're on a crime scene or called to, a disturbance, to start to look at and ask the right questions to be able to make that connection to, could there be trafficking happening here, so that they can, identify victims quicker. So I think in the state of Connecticut, we've done a good job. I was just reading an article today that, I think it was in New Mexico, that it's not a mandate or a law that officers are trained, but in the state of Connecticut, it is. And so not only are they mandated to go through annual training, but we also have officers who have stepped up to be trainers to ensure that within their department, their fellow officers have the information that they need.
Great. Thank you. And another question, it's coming from someone who knows a little bit more about what's going on in regards to, there are youth now that are involved in trafficking from the recruitment end. And what are the repercussions for youth doing recruiting? Or, is it different than adults?
No, I think one of the things that one of our intro slides, we put, especially when we're working with kids, we put that if you traffic another human being, because you're a minor, does not protect you from the law. So if you are exploiting another human being, and it could be an age peer or someone older or younger than you, you're still considered a trafficker. The unfortunate part is, like, within our state and other states, most traffickers are not being prosecuted at a high rate. And I remember watching a documentary once where a trafficker said, he used to be a drug dealer, but he stopped doing that because every day his door was getting knocked on, or his police was pinning him to the ground to arrest him for selling drugs. And when he started to sell humans, when he was selling women and girls, no one was coming looking for him. No one was knocking down his door. He wasn't as stressed as he was when he was selling drugs. So it spoke volumes to the fact that how we view the individuals who are trafficking and buying our kids and our adults, it's just like, okay, it's bad, but we're not going to spend the energy and time, or it's too difficult to prosecute. So a lot of the traffickers and buyers are getting away with this level of victimization, and youth are involved in that process as well.
Yeah, so I think that leads into a next question about, can buyers be arrested in the state of Connecticut?
So right now there is a law, because there's prostitution. So let me say this: there's adult quote prostitution law, because the prostitution is illegal, and that is where a lot of people have this conversation, and we've had to do a lot of dispelling this idea that children are prostitutes.
Oh, hang on, folks. It looks like her microphone just froze on us a bit.
Now, one of the things that we've been working on for years is trying to get the Connecticut state law to mirror that of the TVPA, where it's written in a way that both the buyer and the trafficker can be charged for trafficking in person, which is a higher, legal offense.
So this is always a good and important question about what can we do, right? What can we do to stop human trafficking? I know you mentioned we need to work on racism, other things people can do to stop trafficking.
I think education is a big part of it. In my TEDx talk, I mentioned, educate, advocate, and protect. I think in those three realms, education is critical. The problem is that we have a lot of people who don't even realize that trafficking exists in their communities, and trafficking in Connecticut is a backyard issue. So the reality is that there are kids and adults in your own communities that are being trafficked. So one, understand what human trafficking is. Understand how to educate your community about this topic. Become a trainer. Educate yourself beyond what you hear in a short webinar such as this, and be able to give that information for it. That's one tangible thing you can do. You can be an advocate when there's legislation, which there will be some this season around trafficking laws. Go testify or give a testimony, call your legislators, advocate for them to have more stringent laws that protect our children and those who are vulnerable in our community, and hold the buyers and the traffickers accountable. So you can do advocacy work as well. Protect your children, understand the risk of online solicitation and grooming. It's happening heavily right now because of COVID and the isolation that happens. So if you don't understand how children are being solicited online, do some research and get some information. If you see something, say something. One of us, the survivor, had shared that once where, no one noticed and asked the right questions to realize that she was being victimized. So her victimization went on for years. So when you see something that looks a little bit out of sorts, no one is saying to go in and try to rescue anyone, because you put yourself and that potential victims at risk, but call and say, I have some suspicion, I have some concern, here's what I saw, here's what I know or understand, so that someone is paying attention, and that potentially someone can, go in and support that child, or maybe an arrest can be made, because this is something that is happening to multiple individuals. So there's a lot that folks can do. I think it can feel so overwhelming, and you can feel helpless in the fact that it's like, well, how am I going to save? Be a volunteer for the underground ministry, where they are doing their best to support survivors, both on the adult side and on the youth side. Donate. Your funds can go help support a lot of these nonprofit organizations that are doing works to help support victims and survivors of this crime. So there's a lot of different ways, depending on where your time availability is and what your resources are, that you can do to lend a hand and help hopefully eradicate this. When you hear conversations that are inappropriate, and you realize that, someone you may know in your own circle is okay with, purchasing children for sex, address that issue, have those difficult conversations. Don't just allow it to sit there and not say anything, because that's how we continue to perpetuate this crime.
And I would just add that if folks go to our website, catholicsocialjustice.org, in our resource section, we have a lot of resources on human trafficking, including something about Know the Signs, other presentations where you can learn more about human trafficking, and our trafficking team can even do presentations so that you can share this information with your parish community too. There's lots of ways to learn more. So someone's asking you kind of an opinion piece here. Do you think this doesn't get the attention it deserves because the majority of trafficked children are children of color? It seems kind of like a continuation of racial injustice.
I would say 100% yes to that, but I think a part of the reason why this is what it's fascinating to me, because I don't think people are paying attention to who the victims are as much. And when I went through the myths, right, it's predominantly white women and girls. So if people are holding that narrative in their head, which could be motivating people to want to do this work and be a part of this movement, it's not necessarily the victim piece of it that I think is leading to this lack of response. I think it's the buyer and trafficker side of the equation that is leading to this continuation of victimization, because if those are predominantly white men, who is holding them accountable? Who is saying that this is wrong when we have a system that has been built on, white men having power and control and being able to get away with crimes that most human beings in other countries would not be able to, right? So when you start to think about it through that lens, is the victimization continuing because it's children of color? Or is the victimization continuing because we're not holding these individuals who we know? Because demand abolition, this is not my own perspective as a Black woman. I don't want anyone to walk away from this conversation saying I'm demonizing white men, because that is not my intent in this conversation. And I know that other men of color are also traffickers and buyers. So this is not to demonize white men, but what we do know from the data that has been extracted on the demand side is that it is predominantly white men. When you hear the narratives of these victims, it is white men doing the victimization or purchasing or buying. So for me, this is a complicated issue because I question whether or not we even talk enough about the identity of the victims. But I also know that there is this other piece of the white contingency that is not being dealt with and addressed, that is fueling the demand for victimization.
So here's an advocacy question I think we have time for, because I think this is something actually that's coming up in Connecticut. Are survivors' police records being expunged in Connecticut for crimes they committed if they were a victim?
So that's such an interesting question and timely as well. I wonder if it's someone that's, working on vacatur. But right now there is a law that's being drafted that would hopefully assist with those individuals who committed a crime as a base of their victimization. So because they were being trafficked and they were forced to perform certain criminal acts, that they can request vacatur. But that is not, and I just attended a webinar on it, and I am not an expert by any means. The Quinnipiac Law School right now is doing a lot of work in this area and pushing this. The Trafficking in Person Council is working with them on this. So I would say if you want very specific details about that, you can reach out to or go to both of those websites to get additional information. But yes, we are trying to move to being a state that do vacatur for some of these criminal acts. And also decriminalizing children who are arrested or charged with crimes that were a result of them being exploited and trafficked. And Love 146 has done a lot of job advocating for a law in that area, as well as the TIP Council.
Okay, great. So there was one more question about the signs, and I would just say, go to our website. There's a whole list of know the signs. That's part of a whole nother workshop. As there was another question also about demand, and I think that's a whole nother workshop too.
Yeah, the demand piece is really, when we talk about we always have a slide that we talk about the economics of human trafficking. And we talk about the fact that there's a demand, there's a supply piece. It's just like the economics. And then there's the individuals who will ensure that the supply happens. And we don't talk enough about the demand. We don't talk, there's millions and millions of children being victimized. Forget about even the adults. We haven't even added the adults into that equation, but millions of children being victimized every night. And the reality is that there is a demand and a want to have sex with children. I want to emphasize that. It is not like, oopsies, I found out after the fact that this was a minor child. There are people who are requesting, who are purchasing, who are looking for children to victimize. So until we also tackle and really face and confront the buyer side of this equation, until we hold accountable these buyers for what they're doing and the victimization that they're continuing to perpetuate, this is not a crime that's going to go away because we're talking about the trafficker and the victim alone. We have to start holding those buyers accountable, because without them, there wouldn't be a need for the supply.
Amen. Amen. So I think that's all the time we have for questions. I see a lot of comments that are coming in the chat too, just really thanking you. For many people, this was very new to them, very surprising about the stats that you've shared, the myths that you dispelled, kind of disturbing too, but it's so important for us to know. So thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate, I want to say, Lynn, I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate you guys having this forum on social justice and really confronting and dealing with issues of racism in our society. And I'm grateful to have had the opportunity and a platform to have this conversation, because as I said, we're not having it enough and we're not talking about it enough. So the fact that you gave me, you know, the floor to really have this dialogue and, you know, your whole committee, I greatly appreciate that. And I just wanted to, you know, express that gratitude to you guys. And hopefully we'll be able to continue this dialogue beyond this webinar.
Absolutely. Thank you. So now I want to invite Nancy Strini to share a little bit about what the Archdiocese is doing with our Human Trafficking Task Force.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Yvette. As much as you think you know about this topic, listening to people like you always expands the breadth of the knowledge and the horror that we all experience when we talk about human trafficking. So hats off to you, girl.
Thank you.
My name is Nancy Strini. I'm a member of the Archdiocesan Human Trafficking Task Force and have been since its inception in 2017. Our goal is to raise awareness and provide opportunities for action so that the people in the Archdiocese of Hartford can help to eradicate human trafficking and exploitation. Our members make live and virtual presentations now from a Catholic perspective to raise awareness and call parishes to action. And we're also available to help parishes get things started at a local level, like starting a human trafficking ministry or organizing a prayer event, starting, holding a fair trade fair, maybe around Advent, and distributing posters to local businesses to raise awareness about this issue. Our next big event takes place on February 19th at 6:30 p.m. We're hosting a virtual presentation of the Stations of the Cross in prayer for human trafficking. It's a beautiful, beautiful service, a beautiful image of the Stations of the Cross that will be depicted in both art and photographs and presented virtually by a subsection of our task force membership. As Lynn mentioned, you can check out the resources that we have on the website, catholicsocialjustice.org. There are prayer resources, presentations, calls for action, and you can take a look there and be in touch if you or your parish want some help getting something started at the local level. And I know that Lynn's going to send out a registration information for the Stations of the Cross, as well as any upcoming events hosted by the Office of Catholic Social Justice Ministry. So with that, I say thank you and good night. Thanks again to Yvette. I've seen your stuff before and you are good.
Thank you. Oh, could I just quickly do a plug? I forgot to put it in chat. If anyone has any questions or you need any information, you can reach me at yyoung@thevillage.org. So yyoung@thevillage.org. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And so I was going to announce that our next Open Wider Hearts webinar is going to be on February 3rd. It's called The Three Amigos Speak About Race. We're going to have Monsignor Donnelly from Sacred Heart Church in Southbury, Iman Gazman Aga of the Albanian Muslim community in Waterbury, and Rabbi Eric Polikoff from B'nai Israel in Southbury. They are known as the Three Amigos, and they are all going to be talking about racial relations from the perspective of their three religious traditions. Immediately after this webinar, you will receive a very brief survey. The survey is going to ask you if you would like to have a presentation in your parish on human trafficking, so please fill that out. And also, we are recording this event, and we will send out a link to the recording as well as to our next upcoming events. So thank you again, Beth, and thank you all for attending. Have a good night.